the cultural shock rarely arrives through dramatic moments. It appears quietly, embedded in ordinary scenes, hidden inside behaviors so small they almost escape notice. For Americans observing Australian daily life, the surprise is not found in landmarks or accents, but in subtle habits that reshape the atmosphere of everyday interaction. These are not gestures designed to impress. They exist because the culture expects them to exist. One of the first things Americans to notice is the relaxed emotional volume of public life. Conversations move without urgency. Voices rarely rise. Even in busy environments, there is an underlying calm that feels deliberate. In places where Americans might anticipate impatience or visible stress, Australians often respond with pauses, half smiles, or understated acknowledgement. Time appears less adversarial, less something to conquer. Small social exchanges carry this difference clearly. Casual greetings are brief but sincere. There is little performance in politeness, no exaggerated friendliness, no coldness either. Australians often communicate comfort through understatement, relying on tone rather than words. For Americans accustomed to expressive affirmation, this restraint can feel disorienting at first, as if something is missing. Over time, it becomes clear that the meaning is simply delivered more quietly. Another subtle shock appears in how Australians relate to authority and hierarchy. Titles are used sparingly. Formal distance is minimized. Superiors and subordinates often speak with similar language, and status is rarely emphasized in casual conversation. Americans used to visible markers of rank may initially misinterpret this as lack of seriousness, only to realize that competence and respect are assumed rather than announced. Public spaces also reveal cultural priorities. Australians tend to move with spatial awareness, giving room without apology, avoiding unnecessary confrontation. There is an unspoken agreement to not impose emotionally or physically. Even disagreement is softened, framed with humor or indirect language. Where Americans might expect debate, Australians often offer deflection. Perhaps most surprising are the moments of silence. Australians are comfortable with them. Gaps in conversation are not rushed to be filled. Silence is not seen as awkward, but neutral. For Americans shaped by conversational momentum, these pauses can feel heavy at first, until they begin to feel grounding. These small behaviors accumulate. They shape the emotional climate of daily life in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. What shocks Americans is not any single action, but consistency. The repetition of calm, restraint, and internal economy gradually reveals a culture less concerned with display and more focused on ease. This difference becomes more visible in moments of mild inconvenience. When plans change, when delays occur, or when systems move slower than expected, Australians often respond with acceptance rather than resistance. There is rarely an instinct to escalate. The reaction is not passive, but measured, shaped by an assumption that frustration rarely improves outcomes. Americans observing this pattern often recognize how deeply their own culture has trained them to challenge inefficiency, to verbalize dissatisfaction as a form of control. Another small but striking behavior appears in humor. Australians frequently use irony and understatement to soften interactions. Compliments are downplayed. Achievements are rarely highlighted directly. Self-deprecating remarks function as social glue, signaling equality and approachability. For Americans accustomed to confidence being expressed openly and positively, this habit can initially appear like a lack of ambition. Over time, it reveals a cultural preference for humility over self-promotion. Workplace interactions further reinforce this contrast. Professional environments tend to maintain a casual surface, even when expectations are high. Dress codes are relaxed. Language remains informal, yet responsibility is stilled. embedded quietly rather than enforced loudly. Americans sometimes expect structure to announce itself through formality, and the absence of visible pressure can feel misleading at first. Even emotional reactions follow this pattern. Australians often avoid dramatizing stress or disappointment in public settings. Emotional expression is moderated, not suppressed, but filtered. There is a collective sensitivity to not burden others unnecessarily. Americans raised in a culture that normalizes sharing emotional states openly may perceive this as emotional distance, until they recognize it as a form of respect. Small rituals of daily life echo the same values. Breaks are taken without guilt. Leisure is not framed as a reward for productivity, but as a necessary part of balance. There is less emphasis on constant optimization. Time outside work holds legitimacy on its own. Americans frequently notice how this shifts conversations away from status and toward shared experience. These behaviors rarely announce themselves as cultural rules. They are learned through observation rather than instruction. That is why the shock feels gradual. It is discovered not through explanation, but through accumulation. Each small interaction reinforces the same underlying message. Life is meant to be navigated with ease rather than intensity. As Americans spend more time observing these patterns, the contrast becomes less surprising and more revealing. The shock transforms into reflection, not about Australia alone, but about the assumptions carried quietly from elsewhere. Over time, these small behaviors begin to shape perception rather than simply stand out as differences. Americans immersed in the environment often notice a gradual recalibration of expectations. Interactions feel less transactional. Daily life carries fewer emotional spikes. The absence of constant urgency subtly alters how effort, success, and presence are interpreted. What once felt slow begins to feel intentional. This cultural rhythm influences how relationships develop. Connections form without pressure to impress or accelerate intimacy. Friendships are through shared routine rather than dramatic bonding moments. Reliability is demonstrated quietly through consistency instead of promises. Americans accustomed to fast emotional signaling may initially struggle to read these cues, only later realizing that depth, expressed through stability rather than intensity. The same restraint shapes public identity. Australians rarely frame themselves through occupation or achievement in casual settings. Identity is treated as fluid, not something that needs constant reinforcement. For Americans used to defining themselves through productivity or ambition, this can feel unsettling at first, as if personal value has been removed from the conversation. Gradually, it introduces an alternative framework, where worth exists independently of performance. Even conflict resolution reflects this mindset. Disagreements are often diffused before they fully surface. Humor, distance, or silence are used to prevent escalation. The goal is not to win, but to preserve equilibrium. Americans raised to believe that clarity requires confrontation may misread this as avoidance, until they see how rarely situations spiral into lasting tension. As these patterns settle in, the initial shock gives way to something quieter. The small things no longer feel small. They reveal a coherent philosophy embedded in everyday behavior. A preference for balance over assertion. For emotional sustainability over constant expression. For coexistence rather than dominance. In this light, what shocks Americans most is not the difference itself, but how naturally it functions. These behaviors are not framed as lifestyle choices or cultural statements. They are simply how life is lived. Observing them invites a broader reflection on how cultures decide what deserves energy, attention, and emphasis. In the end, the smallest habits often carry the largest meanings. They show how a society relates to time, emotion, and one another without ever needing to explain itself. And for Americans watching closely, These quiet details become the most enduring lesson of all.